Good evening, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this public lecture by Mr. Carlos Gutierrez. Let me begin, first of all, with an apology. I'm truly sorry that I invited you all to Shangri-La Hotel, because actually we prefer to have this lecture at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, but this is exam week, so you get the benefit of Shangri-La Hotel as a result of students studying for exams. As some of you may know, I follow the tradition of Ambassador Tomiko, and I only make 3 points in my introduction, and this is what I will do today. My first point, of course, is about the changing world order that we're experiencing. And it's clear that if the 20th century was the century of the West, the 21st century could be the century of the rest. As you know, Goldman Sachs has predicted that by 2050, the combined economies of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, could be larger than the G6 in US dollar terms, and 3 of the 5 largest economies in the world will be China, India, and Brazil. Now, in this changing world order, the fast-growing emerging economies in Asia and Latin America are obviously poised to play a much bigger role. And clearly, this is why it's very timely to address the topic of United States, Asia, and Latin America, which is a topic that Mr. Gutierrez is going to address today. My second point was to talk a little bit about this triangular relationship between United States, Asia, and Latin America. And it's clear that the United States has very strong relations with Asia. It's also clear that the United States has very strong relations with Latin America. But I think the missing link in this triangle probably is the link between Asia and Latin America. And this is where, frankly, the United States could play a very valuable bridging role in trying to bring together Asia and Latin America closer together. And here, let me mention that we have a kind of unique opportunity coming in the next few years to bring together United States, Asia, and Latin America, because you will have 3 rather significant chair countries of APEC in the next 3 years. This year it's Singapore, next year is Japan, and then a year after that is United States of America. So I think the combination of Singapore, Japan, and the United States could act also as a force to bring together Asia, Latin America, and the United States. Now, given the importance of the topic, and here I come to my third and final point, I'll say a word about the speaker. There's probably no one better qualified than Mr. Carlos Gutierrez to address this issue for us. Sworn in on 7th February 2005, Mr. Gutierrez was the 35th U.S. Secretary of Commerce, where he oversaw a diverse cabinet agency with some 38,000 employees and a $6.8 billion budget focused on promoting American business in the U.S. and the world. And indeed, he was a core member of President Bush's economic team. And President Bush said, and I quote, "He understands the world of business from the first rung on the ladder to the very top. He knows exactly what it takes to help American businesses grow and to create jobs," unquote. Mr. Gutierrez also played a key role in the passage of CAFTA-DR, the Central American Dominican Republic United States Free Trade Agreement, and he also was one of President Bush's point men on comprehensive immigration reform. Before becoming the Commerce Secretary, Mr. Gutierrez worked for 30 years at Kellogg's, and he started as a sales representative in Mexico City. From there, he rose on to become the president and CEO in 1999, and he was the youngest CEO in the company's nearly 100-year history. In April 2000, he was named chairman of the board of Kellogg Company. Mr. Gutierrez was born in Havana in 1953 and came to the United States with his family in 1960. He studied business administration at the Monterrey Institute of Technology in Mexico, and he and his wife Adelia, who's also with us today, have 3 children, Carlos, Erica, and Karina. In fact, we were discussing our common challenges of bringing our children through university. So with that, Mr. Gutierrez, the floor is yours. And after that, we'll have Q&A with all of you. Please, welcome.
Thank you very much, Kishore, and thank you to all of you for taking the time to be here, for your interest. It's a great pleasure to be back in Singapore. This is my wife's first visit, and I had not been here since 1997. And it was impressive in 1997, and I can't tell you how impressive it continues to be. I think everyone should come to Singapore at least once, because there's a lot to learn from what you have all done, from the Singapore experience, from what this country has achieved in a very short period of time, and the way that it has been achieved. So I congratulate you for that, and I'm privileged to be able to add and to contribute to that with this brief lecture. I should tell you, in the spirit of full disclosure, that I am a member of the Republican Party. So as I talk about the current administration, I'm going to try to do it in a nonpartisan way. I'm going to do it objectively and just try to think of the circumstances as they are, and try not to add a political spin. If once in a while a political spin comes out, please forgive me. It's hard to avoid, but it is an understatement, obviously, to say that we are all going through a difficult economic time. Everywhere you look, with a very few exceptions, what you see is declining GDP, increasing unemployment, and of course declining asset prices, which is adding to the concern of deflation worldwide. Stock market, even though in the U.S. it's come up a little bit over the last few weeks and people are celebrating, we have to remember it's a long way from where it was in 2007 at its peak. So we're all, to some degree, feeling those effects, and there is pretty much consensus around the world that we need financial regulation, and that's something that I believe that we're going to get on with it. We're going to do that, and pretty much everyone understands that we have a need for that. I believe the single biggest thing that's happening in the U.S. economy, and the single biggest priority, and the one thing that has to be fixed, is the credit system. And any time that we take our focus away from that, we are solving either the wrong problem or we're fixing the wrong priorities. The credit system needs to be solved. It has improved. It's getting better. There's more commercial paper being issued. There are more loans that are being made available to small businesses, to consumers, but the system isn't fixed. And what is happening, which has happened before, anytime you have something as visible as Wall Street being the cause of the crisis, Wall Street and bankers, you have a very easy target, and it is very subject to and easy to turn into populism. So today in the U.S., if you ever want a round of applause for your audience, criticize bankers. If you want a big round of applause, say something bad about Wall Street. That will always go a long way. The problem with that dynamic is that the system hasn't been fixed. But because it is so unpopular and because it is so easy to be against bankers and against Wall Street, the fix to the financial crisis may turn up to be too little, because we are trying to do it in a cost-effective way. We are trying to do it without having to go back to Congress and say, you know what, we need more money for the bankers. No one wants to do that because it's very unpopular. But there are those who believe that we may be still $2 trillion away from a solution. And because of the political sensitivity, no one wants to go to Congress and say, Congress, we need more money. So trying to solve this problem in a low-cost way may turn up to be a very expensive approach over the long haul. And we'll have to see that. But that, for me, continues to be the key issue. In the meantime, stimulus packages are very much in vogue. They're very fashionable. Everyone is doing a stimulus package. Every stimulus package is different. And some countries can afford to do bigger stimulus packages. The nature of the efforts are different in most countries. But let me just give you an idea of what has been put in place in terms of spending, stimulus, or new budgetary priorities in the U.S. Over the last couple of months. Our stimulus package was roughly $800 billion, and if you add interest expense to the cost of the money, you're probably talking $1 trillion. We also added, this is probably not noticed because it's a very small amount these days, but we added $32 billion to the portion of the 2009 budget that had not been approved. So it was increased by $32 billion. We have put a $600 billion as a placeholder to fix health care. And we have also added to our long-range budget a $600 billion tax, which we call cap and trade, designed to confront the problem of climate change. So on one hand, we have the banking problem that we haven't fixed yet, but we are going ahead and spending money on future programs and other things that are perceived to be also priorities. So what's happening is that in the U.S., like in other countries around the world, our deficit is just going through the roof. 2009, these are estimates for 2009. U.S. deficit as a percent of GDP, 13%. And we're talking about a $14 trillion economy. So these are very large numbers. The tax revenues that we normally get, just to give you an idea, are about 18% of GDP. So in a typical year, revenues from taxes are about 18%, and government expenses are now close to 30%. So a very large problem that needs to be solved. The UK, 12% deficit, France, 6.5%, Germany, 5%, Spain, Mr. Ambassador, close to 10%. I hope that number is right. Russia, 8%, Japan, close to 6%, India, 7%. Interestingly, Singapore and China, close to 4%. So actually on the low side. But the whole world is facing budget deficits and very large budget deficits. And even though we have said we're going to cut the deficit in half, as all of you know, it's all down to assumptions. And the assumptions that we have made in order to cut the deficit in half are somewhat optimistic. The U.S. economy is supposed to grow by 4% in 2010. in order to cut the deficit by 50%. I don't know if anyone in this room believes that the U.S. economy will grow by 4% next year. The other thing that is a difficult challenge in Washington is that the plan assumes that we're going to cut expenses. And I can tell you the most difficult thing to do in Washington, D.C., and perhaps here in Singapore and other countries, is to cut a program that has already been put in place. It's very difficult to do. It's close to impossible. The executive branch can take the money down, but Congress puts it back in. So it's very hard, unlike business, to say my strategy is to cut expenses, because it's not easy to implement and it's not feasible. So the big question is, if we have these deficits and growth is not going to come in as much as we thought it would be, then the question is, what will happen to taxes? And you probably all know that the administration has said we're going to increase taxes on people who make more than $250,000 a year. Yesterday, the administration announced new tax regulations for multinational firms. But the concern among many is that even all of that will not be enough, and that we may be facing a new era of very, very high taxes that will change the basic structure of the U.S. economy. The U.K. just increased taxes, as you well know. They're facing these deficits. Part of our problem is that when we say increase taxes on people who make more than $250,000 a year, we're talking about a lot of small businesses, because small businesses file as individuals. So any small business that makes more than $250,000 a year will now face a tax increase. And in our economy in the U.S., like Singapore, I think, small businesses represent about 70% of all jobs. And 50% of all new jobs are created by companies that are less than 5 years old. So people think that the U.S. economy is about big multinational firms, Coca-Cola and General Electric and IBM. Yes, but 70%, and the vitality and the energy and the innovation usually comes from small businesses. Microsoft was a small business 30 years ago. So those are concerns. Those are concerns that we all have related to what happens to the economy, assuming that we do fix the banking crisis, and assuming that we get into the next phase. So we could have a situation around the world where all of us, because we have deficits, we are all borrowing money at the same time. And we are all trying to attract investment at the same time. And that, of course, could generate higher interest rates. It could generate higher inflation. And that's something that we all have to watch. But if there's anything that's clear today more than ever before, is that we are in this together. And if there was ever an idea that we can decouple one economy from the other, I think the current crisis has shown us that there is no such thing as decoupling. When one economy does poorly, the other economy feels it. And there isn't one economy that I can think of that has survived this crisis without being impacted. China's growth rate is now 6%, but you hear people talk about that for China, 0 is 8. So 6% for China is essentially, almost like a 2% decline. And everyone else is feeling it in their economy. So no one is isolated. No one is an island. No one has the luxury of thinking about this as their own parochial problem. I think the only two economies in the world that didn't suffer because of the banking crisis are North Korea and Cuba. So maybe that's something. Maybe that's an advantage there. And it's an irony that at a time when we have realized that no one is an island, no one is isolated, there is no decoupling, we're all in this together, we are seeing countries more and more turn inward and behaving as if though their problem is only their problem and their focus is on their country. And you hear people ask the question about protectionism. They'll say, do you think we are going to go into an era of protectionism? For me, the answer is we are in an era of protectionism. It's not whether we're going to go or not. We are living protectionism. The difference is that when the G20 get together, they all say the right things. Every leader makes a speech and they'll say, we have to avoid protectionism. So people say, "Oh, boy, that's good. I'm glad they're saying that, because that means that we are not going to fall into that trap." But everyone's going back home and in one way or another practicing protectionism. We see it in the U.S., we see it in countries in this region of the world, we see it in countries in Europe, we see it in Latin America. Everyone is looking after their own and justifying it because we are in a crisis. The problem is that the more we do that, the less we'll be able to solve a global problem, because this is a global problem. So to say we're going to avoid protectionism, that isn't a strategy. That isn't good enough. I'd like to see some aggressiveness. That's too passive. To avoid protectionism, we should be doing things, not avoiding something. So that is very visible in our part of the world, in the Western Hemisphere. There were some discussions not long ago about renegotiating NAFTA. That has changed. We're not talking about renegotiating NAFTA anymore, but we're not doing anything to make NAFTA stronger. And there are agreements that were made under NAFTA that aren't being adhered to. So we are seeing that happen in a relationship as important to the U.S. as the North American Free Trade Agreement. Just to give you an idea, that was a $280 billion relationship about 12 years ago. This year it should be a $1 trillion relationship. It has been phenomenal. And it's too big to roll back. A car is no longer made in one country, it's made in all three countries. And supply chains have been integrated, and computer systems have been integrated. So, we need to be making NAFTA stronger and bigger, and not saying, well, we're not going to renegotiate it, but just leave it alone. We have right now, as we speak, pending free trade agreements. We have a free trade agreement that has been pending for 2 years with Colombia, where Colombia exports to the U.S. duty-free. We export to Colombia paying a duty. So there's no risk. There's no downside. What the agreement does is level the playing field and take duties down for U.S. exporters. But we can't get it approved because politically it's very sensitive. Because politically people don't want to talk about trade, because there is a perception that trade is not good, and no one wants to take a risk of trying to convince people that that trade isn't a cause of or one of the causes of the crisis, which of course is a terrible tragedy, because trade has been good for the whole world, and trade has been good for the U.S., and trade can continue to be good for the rest of the world. We have a free trade agreement pending with Panama. A couple of years before the expansion of the Panama Canal, and then the single biggest pending free trade agreement was South Korea. A tremendous opportunity to grow trade and investment and business with a major economy, our seventh largest exporting market, but it's held up because of the wave of populism and protectionism that we're seeing, not just in the U.S., by the way, but in countries around the area. This is a time when many countries in Latin America are doing better than ever before. A lot of people ask me about, well, but isn't Latin America going to an extreme left because of Chavez and because of Bolivia and Cuba? And that's part of Latin America. But the Latin America that we see, and the Latin America that I believe represents the future, is Brazil, Colombia, Uruguay, Peru, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Panama. And imagine Panama with an expanded Panama Canal, Mexico. These are all countries that have welcomed free trade, that have welcomed investment. I was telling Kishore a little while ago, Chile I think is the country with the most free trade agreements in the world, 55. I was in Costa Rica not long ago. They have done a tremendous job in attracting investment for exports. So one of Intel's largest investment, I know I just met the Costa Rican ambassador, I'm sorry if, yes sir. One of Intel's largest investment in the world is in Costa Rica, because that was a good environment in which to invest and a good environment in which to do R&D and then export. These are the countries that represent Latin America, and what a tremendous opportunity now to grow our relationship with them, but unfortunately, it's not moving forward. It's not moving forward at the speed at which it should be. There's another area that is being impacted throughout the world that isn't talked about enough, and that is also a result of this financial crisis. And it's also displaying this instinctive, almost xenophobia that is surfacing in some countries, and that is the inclination to blame immigration. And I'll tell you, in my country, in the U.S., if you look at our history, there has never been a time when we have been prosperous that hasn't been tied to immigration. And any time in our past that we clamp down on immigration, we pay a price. In spite of that, every 70 or 80 years, we go through this problem of doubting immigration and doubting whether immigrants add to our country. And fortunately, up until now, wisdom has always prevailed. And I would hope that wisdom will prevail again. I'll give you some very quick numbers just to give you one idea why immigration is so important. And this is just one aspect of immigration. Our working age population in the U.S. is growing at about 0.3%. That's people entering the working age, 25 to 55. But it needs to grow at 1.1% if we want to grow our economy by 3%. So population grows, the workforce grows by 1.1%, and the rest you pick up through productivity. So unless we're growing our working age population a certain portion, we can't grow our economy. We can't create the jobs. We can't have the multiplying effect. We can't create prosperity, which means we cannot create prosperity without immigrants. And that is not just the U.S., but if you look around the world, Japan, these are just some examples, Japan, Russia, Russia's population is declining. In Europe, I mean, Italy, Spain, countries that were once known for growing populations, the population rate in some of these countries aren't reaching the replacement rate. So a country like Italy has an infrastructure for a certain number of people, and they look out 20, 30 years, and based on how they're growing, they're going to have to reduce their infrastructure, reduce the size of their country, of their society, because they're going to be a smaller player simply because they will not have the workforce. The irony is that if I think of countries in Europe and compare, maybe Spain is an exception, because Spain, I think, has done a very good job with immigration and has been able to use immigration as an advantage. But countries like Germany, the UK, others are struggling because they're not used to immigration. It's not like Singapore, it's not like the US, it's not like Canada, that have actually built a society on the basis of immigration. Because the U.S. has this advantage, we could have a competitive advantage that can last for a century, and we're not seizing it. And I say it can last for a century because you know well in Singapore, the world's best scientists want to go and work in the U.S. The tremendous irony of this is that we only give 65,000 H-1B visas, high-skilled visas, for PhD scientists to come and work in the U.S. That number is exceeded in the month of January. So for the rest of the year, we need more, but we can't get more because the law doesn't allow it. And we also need low-skilled immigration. But there's one reality in our economy, is that immigrants add vitality, energy, new ideas, ambition. They have a hunger that adds to the overall society. And I thought the U.S. was the best place in the world to demonstrate that. After having been in Singapore, maybe the U.S. is not. Maybe Singapore is the best place to demonstrate that. But the point is, we cannot lose that insight. Germany, being part of the EU, my understanding is that Germany is now closing their border to workers coming from Eastern Europe, even though they have an agreement that these workers should come in freely. And that's just one example, but there are examples all over the world that are going to set us back, after decades of progress. We talked a little while ago about leadership and how everything is leadership. Companies are all about leadership, and countries are all about leadership. When I mentioned Colombia the other day, about how Colombia has turned itself around, you can point at the leadership. And it was a man by the name of President Álvaro Uribe who turned that country around when it was on the verge of becoming a failed state. And no one knows the value of leadership more than Singapore, and what leadership does to a country and an economy and to the future of a society. So I would say that there are three things that I'm looking for as I look around the world. Who is leading this crisis? And Kishore just asked me this question a little while ago. As you look around the world, where is the great leadership? Let me tell you what I think will be the characteristics of the leaders that I have observed and the leaders that will surface. First thing is leaders who are willing to make unpopular decisions at a time of great populism. Leaders who choose good policy over good politics. It is very easy to fall into the trap of good politics. Good politics is criticizing bankers. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's good for the economy. Good politics could be criticizing free trade, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what the country needs. The challenge will be the leaders who say, I know this isn't popular. I know that politically this is not the right thing to say, but this is what the country needs. And that's what, look around the world and you can decide where you see that. The second thing is a world view, an international view of their country's problems, an understanding that we can no longer look inside and be parochial and solve our own problems, that we need all to become world statesmen, that we can't just say, I am the leader of my country and I'm going to take care of my country and that's enough. It's no longer enough because we are in this together more so than ever before. And then the last thing I would say, which this may sound somewhat ideological, but I've spent 30 years of my life in business. And you learn one thing in business, and that is that you can only afford to do what works. Because either you have numbers or you don't have numbers. Either you have results or you don't have results. And when you're faced with that type of measure, you have no choice but to do what works. Because if it doesn't work, you're out of a job and somebody will come in who can get results. So I think the third aspect of leadership is a recognition that free enterprise, the private sector, business is what creates long-term prosperity, not a stimulus package every year, not government programs. Those may be good for 1 year, those may be good to get us through the crisis, but that's not where the new ideas will come from, the innovation, the investment, the entrepreneurship, the solution. I'll give you an example of companies that have surfaced during recessions. In the 1980s, we had a very difficult recession in the U.S. During that recession, Microsoft was born. Some retail chains, The Limited, Gap, and many, many other Silicon Valley companies, Intel, Cisco. In the 1920s, during the Great Depression, Hewlett-Packard was born as a small business. We know now in a garage, but what is today Hewlett-Packard? Texas Instruments, United Technologies, Revlon, and many, many others. So there's great optimism if we continue to create the environment to allow entrepreneurs, people who take risks, people who invest, people who create jobs, people with a dream, to have an environment where they can act and not believe that somehow, because of what's happened, because of the financial crisis, that the meaning is that now the government must take over the economy. Where that happens, the recovery will be long and painful. And let me just close out by with a quote that I just read not long ago. As I mentioned, when you come from a world of business, you do what works, because There's no substitute for cash flow. You can't make it up. Either you have it or you don't have it. And a theory can sound very good, but you can't say that a theory is an end result. So here is probably a quote that says it all for me, and maybe what we're running into, what we're going to find is that the new ideology of the future after this crisis is pragmatism. And here is a great quote from one of the great leaders of our time. This is a quote from your minister mentor, Lee Kuan Yew. It says, "I was never a prisoner of any theory. The acid test I applied to any theory or scheme was, would it work? Would it deliver results?" That is the same leadership that we will need in every single country in the world to lift us out of this recovery. So what an honor it is to be talking about this in a school that bears the name of this remarkable leader, of this remarkable man. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. You know, one of the privileges of being the chairman of a talk is that I get to ask the first question. And I'm going to take advantage of that privilege, you know, because I share many of your views, especially your point about the importance of promoting free trade. And, you know, I'm sure when you were Commerce Secretary, you must have traveled around the United States of America promoting the virtues of free trade. And you must have got some pushback from people saying, excuse me, as a result of free trade, we get bigger and bigger deficits. And the United States always has trade deficits, never has trade surpluses. And the United States is always losing jobs to China, India, Mexico. So they say to you, Carlos, why are you promoting free trade? How do you answer that question?
It's a very good point. Let me just, two things. NAFTA that I talked about is 30% of the U.S. trade, so it's a very big part of our trade. If you look at numbers before NAFTA and numbers after NAFTA, unemployment was higher before NAFTA than after NAFTA, and that's even if you take into account the most recent year where unemployment has gone up. GDP growth is higher after NAFTA than before NAFTA. And even the rate of inflation has been lower after NAFTA than before NAFTA. So those are numbers, those are real numbers. The trade deficit is interesting because I found that the anti-trade point of view gives a lot of importance to the trade deficit. So it's quite an irony that our trade deficit has improved by $60 billion over the last year. And what I tell people is, boy, I miss the days when our trade deficit was higher, because that's when we were growing. And there are countries around the world, I'll give you one example, Germany, that has a trade surplus. But German growth over the last, I don't know, decade or so, maybe 1.5%. German unemployment has run 8-9%. Would I trade U.S. numbers of 5 years ago with German numbers of 5 years ago because they had a trade surplus? No. So you can fix the trade deficit and do a lot of damage to the economy. And I think that's part of the importance of having the right measures and knowing what you are measuring and knowing what your right targets are. But it's a great question.
And so they were convinced?
Some were. It's conventional wisdom that that people think that that trade is unfair because you're competing with lower wages. And if someone has lost their job, you won't be able to convince them that trade is good. So trade is good, obviously, in the context of the whole country, the whole economy. But the anecdotal arguments are often taken into account, and those are the arguments that people use to combat it. Did we convince everyone? No. Our last free trade agreement was passed through Congress by one vote. So that's how tight, and that was 3 years ago. So we'll see when Colombia comes up if we're able to convince everyone to support it.
Maybe let me just ask you one quick question.
Yes.
Because the other issue in which I think Singapore is in complete agreement with you is on immigration. And that too, as you know, there's a huge political backlash in the United States against immigration. The general feeling is that low-wage workers coming in from Latin America, Asia, and taking away jobs from Americans. So how do you counter that argument? What's your big point about that?
Well, the point I made about the numbers, I suppose that wasn't very convincing because that. But the numbers are important. If you want to grow, you need labor, you need people, whether it be scientists or low skilled. But many people mention that the reason we have immigration from Latin America is because there are no jobs in Latin America, so people are forced to come to the U.S. The reason they come to the U.S. is because there are jobs in the U.S. There are jobs that are available in the U.S. And if those immigrants don't come, those jobs will not be filled. The unemployment rate of undocumented workers in the U.S. is below the national average, which means, and this is true when our unemployment was 4%, the unemployment rate of undocumented workers was less than 4%, which means that people come for only one reason, because there are jobs. Because there are jobs that either Americans do not do or Americans won't do. If you go back 40, 50 years ago, 1/3 of the population did not have a high school diploma. So they found a lifelong career in agriculture, a lifelong career maybe driving a truck. But it was okay because their children went to school and their children built a different future. And they had a career and they retired in that career. Today, it's less than 10% of the population does not have a high school diploma. And there are still jobs. Those jobs that those people did are still there. They still have to get done. Those are the low-skilled jobs. On the high-skilled jobs, I can tell you that companies like Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, Intel, Boeing have to go and build R&D centers outside of the U.S. because they can't find enough scientists in the U.S. One example, which I thought was just quite hard to believe, one of the founders of Google lives in Canada. He's a U.S. citizen, but his wife cannot find a green card. So he has to live with her in Canada. And you think about the contribution that one person has made to the U.S. economy and society. He is Indian American, originated from India, but has to live in Canada because his wife won't get a green card. Those are the types of things that you say, this is wrong, this is not logical, it's not sane.
Great. Now I saw a hand over here. Please stand up, identify yourself. There's a microphone coming to you. And then a short, sharp question.
Sir, Timothy from Channel News Asia. Two questions. First question, what would you think is the impact of President Obama's policies on tax havens and collecting taxes from U.S. multinationals? What is that impact on Asia's foreign direct investments and economic growth going forward? And how would that affect the U.S.'s role in providing the missing link between Asia and Latin America?
There are two aspects of that. You use the term tax haven. And if you're talking about tax haven in the context that people move money outside of the country and hide it so they don't have to pay taxes, I think most people would agree that that needs to be addressed. The problem is the repatriation of cash, which is the part of the policy that concerns multinational firms. And there is this idea that that the multinationals are investing overseas instead of investing in the U.S. What this new reform will do essentially is have a double taxation, so that companies will pay on overseas profits, and then they will have to pay immediately on those profits in the U.S. The way the policy is today is that if you keep the cash and you don't repatriate the cash, you only pay once you repatriate it. The impact is going to be that multinational firms will think twice about where they invest, will not be able to invest as much overseas. You may even find some multinational firms thinking twice about having a headquarters in the U.S. So these are policies that I don't believe will answer the question, how are we going to grow? And that's the question we all need to be answering. How are we going to grow? If the answer is we are going to grow by applying a double taxation to multinational firms, I have trouble seeing how those two coincide.
You ask another? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Please explain. Go ahead.
There was a second question. How would that affect the role that the U.S. can play being the missing link between Asia and Latin America?
How will that affect America's role as the missing
Well,
link?
you know, most of the free trade agreements that have been done are in Latin America. And it makes sense because most trade is first developed where you have geographic proximity and advantages. So I'll give you the names of countries with which we have free trade agreements in Latin America. Mexico, Canada, I mean the Western Hemisphere, not Latin America, but Western Hemisphere. Guatemala, Costa Rica, Honduras, Salvador, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Peru, Chile. Those are countries with duty-free access to the U.S. and duty-free access from the U.S., which means that if an Asian company wants to explore doing business in North America, doing business in that part of the world, those are countries that would provide an opportunity for a special relationship with the U.S. because they have free trade agreements. And I hope that we add to that list Colombia and Panama in a very short period of time. And that's a unique advantage that I don't believe many companies have realized, that if you build a plant in Chile, you can import duty-free from the U.S. and you can export duty-free to the U.S. from that country.
Next question. Go ahead.
Hi, Visa from Tampines Junior College. The previous question looked to the future. I would like to ask you about the past. What do you feel were, I mean, being a pragmatic person, what do you feel was the best policy of your administration, and what do you feel was the worst, and why?
Of the Bush administration, and what was the worst? And
yeah, from a pragmatic perspective, because I feel that there are a lot of arguments and differing views. So I'd like to hear from someone who was actually involved. Thanks.
Do we have bad policies? I think
I
that...
mean, I think you can say you're perfect. So
Yes,
okay.
no, that's fine. I would say that one of the best, because there are a couple of very good ones. Tax policy, the reduction of taxes, was a very good policy. We had, before this crisis, we were in a recession. President Bush inherited a recession. And remember, we inherited a technology crash in the stock market, a recession. We had those scandals with Enron. Then we had 9/11. I mean, those are shocks to the economy. And by reducing taxes, investment grew and jobs grew. And we had a string of 52 months of job growth, which is the longest string in our history. So the tax cuts worked. I also think that the trade agenda was very positive. Where things could have been done better is that, and there's an irony here, we let expenses get out of hand. And, you know, Republicans are usually the party of fiscal discipline. And the irony here is that we had, for the first 6 years, a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate. And my theory, and this is just one person's point of view, is that that majority made it difficult to say no, because it was your majority. So a lot of projects were supported, a lot of expenses, a lot of earmarks. I think that was something that if it could be done over again, that would be an area that, from an economic policy standpoint, we should be able to do. The interesting thing is, if you look at today, you have the same setup. You have a Democrat president, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. So it was very easy to pass a $800 billion stimulus package. And that could be the same irony that hurts this administration. It's good to have another party in the House, because you have the give and take, and you have the pressure, and you have the tension that comes with that. So that's what I would say.
Next question, and then please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. My name is Jonathan, currently serving my national service. My question is, in your opinion, with regards to the fixing of the credit system and protectionism, what do you think the Obama administration can actually do to address these two issues?
I'm sorry. Sorry, what was the question?
With regard to fixing of the credit system and protectionism, what do you think, in your opinion, the Obama administration can do in these 4 years to address these problems?
The first is the financial system.
Credit system.
The credit system, yeah.
And then second is protectionism.
In the credit system, as you know, that there are still bad assets, what people call these toxic assets, that are still on the balance sheets of companies. And until those get fixed, they get pulled out of the balance sheet or get written off, companies will be reluctant to lend more, because any shortfall of that asset, any write-down, goes straight to the P&L and goes straight to retained earnings and goes straight to capital. So insolvency is is a real risk. The Obama administration has a plan called public-private partnerships. They call them PPIPs, where the private sector will try to buy those assets. We'll see if that works, because the companies will not want to sell those assets below their book value, because if they do, they have to write off capital, and we're back to where we started. And companies won't want to buy them at higher, because why do they want to overpay? At one point, the idea was the government to come in and buy them. This was the original Paulson plan, to come in and buy them and maybe overpay. But that way you would ensure that you would not have more capital write-downs. Politically, that's very difficult to convince the American people now in Congress to go in and overpay. Eventually, we may find that we have to bite the bullet. And biting the bullet may mean about another $1 trillion of write-downs. And that's what we don't know yet. This week, we're going to publish the Treasury is going to publish the stress tests for the 19 largest banks. And that will give us an idea of what the exposure is. So this is a very important week, and I think Thursday is the date of the publishing of those stress tests. The protectionist side.
Can you give us a guess what the results will be like?
Well,
how many banks will be solvent?
There's a feeling that at least 3 of the large banks need more capital, and we'll see how much. But the $2 trillion number is just one to keep in mind. That in order to, because the stress test says, what happens if unemployment, instead of being 8, goes to 12? What happens to those banks? And what happens to the capital? And how much more money do you have to put in? So it's like a worst-case scenario. And I hope if it's done in a very transparent way, and if it's done the way it was billed, we're going to be able to see how much exposure there is. So Thursday is a very important day for fixing the financial system. On protectionism, I think it's a political problem. There, I don't think it's a problem of a technical balance sheet problem. It is a political problem of how to convince stakeholders who don't like trade that they should like trade. And in this case, there are many unions who don't like trade, and unions who do not want to, who feel they've lost in that aspect and do not want to give up. So I think there, President Obama has a political leadership problem to convince Congress that we have to pass Colombia, Panama, South Korea, that these are important allies, that this is good for both countries, that we will set our relationship back and our economy back if we don't pass these agreements. That if we can start the Doha round of negotiations, one estimate of the WTO Doha talks was that a good agreement could take up to 500 million people out of poverty around the world. So his challenge is to convince Congress and to convince his constituents of that. And I believe that he's going to try to do that. I believe that he's changed his point of view since the campaign, and now it's a matter of whether he'll be successful in doing that.
Great. Lady over here. The question will be answered. Okay. That's the lady at the back there. Yeah. It's the lady, and then I'll come to you. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Is this?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry. Good afternoon. I'm Sarah, and I'll be entering university in August. I'd like to ask what countries in Asia such as China and India, what specific actions they could take with the US and Latin America to show that they are rejecting protectionism and that they would be willing to expand the global economy?
I would say in China, one thing that China could do would be to join the government procurement, to sign up to the WTO government procurement. And what that says, that provision of WTO, if you sign up to that group, would say that you don't have preferences for local companies when the government is procuring services or goods. That would be an example of a very powerful example that that China can do. India, there's probably a more visible point, and that would be to allow retailers to go into India. So, for example, you have Carrefour here.
Yes.
Okay, you can't find a Carrefour supermarket in India.
Singapore allows everybody, by the way.
All right. So that's a protected market. So you have millions of small shopkeepers who are protected. That would be a very bold and very visible action on behalf of the Indian government. And what the U.S. could do would be to submit Colombia for approval and have Congress vote on it. And that would send a message to the world that we're serious.
Gentleman over there. Yeah, it's working. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Lee. I blog in my part-time. Just two quick questions. We've talked about doing what works, but going to the subject of stopping to do what doesn't work, do you see any U.S. administration lifting the embargo on Cuba? And my second question is, what would you say to people who, in certain interest groups, who argue that Chinese investments into Latin America are a strategic threat to U.S. interests in its own backyard?
Well, two tough questions.
Let me answer the second part first. There was discussion about 3 or 4 years ago about whether China was growing too fast and whether the threat of a fast-growing China is just too much for the U.S. I think the question back then should have been, what happens if China stops growing? That's the threat. So I don't believe that China doing business in Latin America is a strategic threat. The stronger China is, the more confident China is, and the more confident China is, the better a world partner it will be. So I don't think the second part should be seen as a threat. Now, you assumed in the way you asked your question that the embargo hasn't worked. And let me give you another point of view. The Castro regime has been anti-American from the very beginning. And it poses a serious and a very interesting question. How do you deal with someone who has declared you their enemy? And I would say that the reason the embargo has succeeded is that it has denied resources to someone who has declared themselves an enemy of your country. And any time that they have had resources, because Canada invests, Europe invests, they haven't used it to improve the lives of Cubans. They've increased the size of the military, they've bought more planes, They've sent their army to Africa, to Latin America, but not to improve the lives of Cubans. So I would say that the question is not when is the U.S. going to change its policy towards Cuba. I would say the question